Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Dr. DeMarte, the jurors have some questions for you. I'm going to ask these questions in the order in which they were submitted. How many forensic cases have you worked on?
I've been doing forensic cases for several years. If we're talking about cases that are specifically where an attorney has hired me or the court has hired me, I've been doing that since 2010 when I became licensed. I've been doing other forensically related work beginning in 2007.
How many times have you testified based on your evaluations?
While I've done several forensic evaluations, I've only been asked to testify 3 times. This is my 3rd time.
How many cases involved abuse?
If this is specific to forensic cases or in general, several of my general evaluations, it's commonly the case that abuse is involved, whether it's child abuse, sexual abuse, or domestic violence. If it's related to forensic cases, I'll need a second to think.
Hypothetically, if a person suffered PTSD because of a bear attack while hiking, would you throw out their PDS test if they lied and said it was a tiger?
Yes, those would be different events. A lot of times what you see with PTSD is that there's different triggering events that remind them of the trauma. So I would expect that a bear and a tiger would look different, smell different, act different, and the subsequent symptoms would be associated with those variables, with those differences among them. So I would say that they were different and that I would.
Would the person be answering the question the same regardless of whether they call the animal a bear or a tiger?
Can you ask that again?
Would the person be answering the questions on the PDS the same regardless of whether they call the animal a bear or a tiger?
They would be answering it very different.
Do you believe absolutely that it is possible to remain purely unbiased in an evaluation once compassion creeps in?
I do think it's possible to remain unbiased if you have some compassion. And there are indicators that we have to look within ourselves and barriers that we have to have in front of us to suggest whether we're crossing the line. So crossing the line could be giving something to someone, or maybe even being triggered by
Overruled.
Maybe even being triggered by our own traumas, our own life experiences that could make us feel biased. So I think it's very possible to have compassion and not be biased, but we have to make sure that we as professionals are really paying attention and watching that line.
What types of people are at risk for developing or having borderline personality disorder?
Unfortunately, anyone's at risk, but what we see is a higher prevalence rate of borderline personality disorder in individuals who have been exposed to trauma and neglect throughout their lifetime. One of the important variables that's often talked about in the literature is this idea of being invalidated by family members and by parents. What invalidation means is if the person says, for example, let's say a child is riding their bike and they fall and they hurt their knee and they're crying because their knee hurts. An example of an invalidation would be a parent saying, your knee doesn't hurt, you're fine. They're invalidating their emotions, they're invalidating their experiences. When we see that happening frequently throughout their childhood, that tends to increase the chances that they'll develop borderline personality disorder.
In the interview Jodi gave, where she stated, "Mark my words, no jury will ever convict me," do you feel that is part of a borderline personality disorder, especially since she is smiling when she said it?
I think that's another example of self-esteem. And it's also an example of that immaturity that I talked about before, making these immature statements.
Overruled.
These immature statements that are often seen in people with borderline personality disorder. I do think that that's consistent.
Wouldn't taking the camera, rather than leaving it, show more organizational thinking capabilities?
I would say that they're both an example of organization, just different type of organization, with the goal being hide the evidence, take away information associated with the killing.
When asked by defense about efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, you stated you had other examples for this category that did not involve Travis. Can you share those examples?
Yes, throughout her diary, she used that word exactly, fear of abandonment. Oh, I take that back. Abandonment. I feel abandoned. She made that comment at least a couple times with other boyfriends. There was also indication in those relationships that they had cheated on her and that she continued to stay in that relationship and then subsequently befriend them and become very close to them despite being treated in that kind of way. Those were some of the examples that were found in other relationships.
Do you think deleting pictures from a camera and then washing that camera is an attempt to remove or destroy evidence?
That's the impression that it gives, yes.
If you had not seen pictures proving that the evidence, photos, was recovered, given your knowledge of cameras, would you have viewed this as an effective attempt to destroy evidence?
Can you ask that again, please?
If you had not seen pictures proving that the evidence, photos, was recovered, given your knowledge of cameras, would you have viewed this as an effective attempt to destroy evidence?
Of putting it, yes. My knowledge of cameras is that if you put it in water, that it would be destroyed and that we wouldn't expect the camera to continue to work and that the memory card would be destroyed. But again, my knowledge of cameras is probably that of the average person.
In your opinion, is it normal for a person who is incarcerated to be depressed and have anxiety?
Yes, I've worked with many individuals who are incarcerated. Interestingly, you don't consistently see it in all of them, but certainly it's not something that's outside of the scope of what we would expect to see in someone who has a significant change in environment, living, at home and then all of a sudden being controlled in a jail setting. It's a big difference, and I would expect to see some changes.
Do you consider Jodi stabbing, shooting, and slitting Travis's throat to be a traumatic event?
That certainly is an event that could be considered traumatic. The variables that would be important to me to know is how she experienced the event.
That should be on the scope.
Overruled.
Yes, no question.
Overruled. You may continue.
PTSD, traumatic events that are associated with PTSD, we look for the person's response to it. Did they experience horror? Did they experience fear associated with the event? If there was this association of being terrified, fear, horror as a result of the event, and there's evidence that there was this horror, fear that continued after the event, then yes, I would consider it as a potential for the development of PTSD.
You said you administered the TSI to Jodi because Dr. Karp had done the same, but you did not re-administer other tests that Dr. Karp or Dr. Samuels had given. Can you explain why?
Yes, the tests that I gave 4 different tests. One was, again, just a measure to make sure that she had the right reading requisites for the self-report measure.
Overruled.
The other tests, the WACE and the MMPI, those are tests that are very commonly used in forensic settings, and for good reason. They provide us a lot of really good and important information. So I made the decision to use those tests because I thought it would be very helpful. In terms of why I didn't use the other tests, I felt like the tests that I gave answered the questions that I needed and that it wasn't necessary to administer those other tests. And I made the decision to administer the TSI because I did want to look at continuity across evaluators.
Do you know what the differences are between the TSI-1 versus the TSI-2?
There's slight differences in terms of scale scores. I have not used the TSI-2, so I'm not as familiar as I am with the TSI-1. And there's updated norms also.
Regarding the PDS answer sheet, exhibit number 555, do you know whose handwriting is on the PDS answer sheet?
Are we,
Mr. Martinez, do you have Exhibit 555?
thank you.
Judge, may we approach?
You may. Dr. DeMarte, you've been handed Exhibit 550. Do you know whose handwriting is on that answer sheet?
I would have to make the assumption that this is,
Objection, speculation.
Sustained. Do you see any issues with Dr. Samuels filling out the answer sheet and possibly summarizing the written answers on Section 2?
of this. Yes, this is often given to the person to fill out themselves. The only time that can happen is if it's someone who doesn't have the mobility to be able to do it themselves or isn't able to see properly, or there's some sort of impairment there that would prevent them from doing it. So I do see it problematic that if Ms. Arias didn't fill this out, that she didn't. That just isn't in line with how it's typically administered and could potentially be suggestive of something else.
Does it cause any concern for you regarding the validity of the test that the written answers appear to be answered by someone who is familiar with psychological verbiage and not in layman's verbiage?
Yes, that would be very concerning.
Follow-up, Mr. Martinez.
I think you indicated previously something about needing a minute to think about when you were being asked about your experience. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And have you had a moment to think about the question?
Yes. And I believe the question was related to how many forensic evaluations. I'm going to have to give a general estimate. Again, I don't keep count of it. I'd say it's probably somewhere, if I'm using forensic evaluations as a general term, working with individuals who have been adjudicated or in the adjudication process, probably no more than 75, somewhere around there.
No other questions?
Come on.
Dr. Markey, you were asked a question about, talking about her feelings of abandonment, and one of the reasons that you thought that she fulfills that criteria was because she stayed in a relationship where the man was cheating on her. That
was
she would
one
continue to
indication.
stay, right?
Yes.
And continuing to stay in a relationship where a man is cheating on you, that's also a sign of low self-esteem, isn't it?
It could potentially.
And you were asked the question about whether or not it's normal to see anxiety and depression in somebody who's on a TSI trauma symptom inventory when the person's in custody. Do you remember that question? Is it normal to see anxiety and depression?
I don't know that it was specific to the TSI. Was that the way it was posed? I think it was just, the question was anxiety and depression.
Okay, well that's fine.
Okay.
Is it normal? So you answered that it's normal to see anxiety and depression in somebody who is in custody, right?
I said that I've seen it in some people and not in all, but it wouldn't be uncommon.
Okay. And the trauma symptom inventory test that you gave to Miss Arias, you gave her 2, right?
Yes.
And one of the ones that you gave her, you were interested in her answering those questions as how they related from her feelings between January 2007 to January 2008, right?
Yes,
So she was not in custody during that time, right?
that's correct.
In fact, that was the time that she was involved with Mr. Alexander.
Yes.
And on that trauma inventory test, that one also showed anxiety, high anxiety levels, right?
High anxiety, yes.
High depression levels.
Yes.
Okay. And you were asked the question about the differences between the TSI-1 and the TSI-2, right?
Yes,
And you answered that you have not even used the TSI-2, is that right?
that's correct.
And the TSI-2, that's been out and available for at least 3 years now, right?
I'm not sure.
I'm
the
sorry,
exact-
2 years.
I'm not sure the exact time.
Well, you gave the TSI-1 to Miss Arias, right?
Yes.
And you did that in 2011?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
So you gave that to her in 2011, but you were aware that the TSI-2 was available at that time, right?
I wasn't aware at that time.
I thought you knew that you just didn't have it because the people you worked for didn't purchase it yet.
I learned about that afterwards. They were the ones that were in charge of purchasing the tests. At that time, I didn't know that a new one had just been released. I had afterwards found out that one had just been released.
Okay, so now you're telling me that you did know that a new one had been released in 2011.
I don't know the date of when it was released. I knew it was released.
In 2011.
I just said I don't know the date that it was released.
I thought you just said that you found out later from it that the owners of Bayless just chose not to buy the TSI-2 at the time that you gave it to Miss Arias, and that's why you didn't have it.
I'd like to clarify.
Isn't that what you just said?
I'd like to clarify.
Did you not say that?
I'm getting a little confused by the verbiage that the way you're phrasing your questions.
Okay, all right. When you gave the TSI-1 to Miss Arias, right?
Yes.
Okay, that was in 2011, correct?
Yes.
And when you gave that to her, you told us before that you did not use the TSI-2, right?
Right.
Okay, and you told us that you did not use the TSI-2 because your employer at the time did not get it yet. Is that correct?
That they did not buy it, yes.
Yes, okay. So that would stand to reason then that the TSI-2 was available in 2011.
I believe it was.
Okay, and so what you're telling us then today also then is that since 2011 you haven't given the TSI-2 ever, right?
No, I have.
You've
Well, I
given
was-
the TSI-2?
Yes. No, I'm sorry. The TSI-1.
Okay, all right.
Yes,
So you've never used the TSI-2?
That is correct.
Okay. So you've never used the updated test then?
I have not used the updated test.
Have you given the TSI-1 since 2011?
Not recently, but yes, in 2011.
Just in 2011?
I've used it while I was at Bayless still, so I left there in August of 2012 and would use it.
Okay, so you haven't used it since 2012 then?
Yes, correct.
And you were asked a question about handwriting on,
I have
oh,
it
you have
here.
it? On the PDF list, right?
Yes.
Okay. And if at the time the PDS test is given, the person does not have the actual test booklet with them, answers can be written down on an extra sheet of paper, can't they?
I wouldn't choose to do that.
But it can happen, right?
Yeah, anybody can choose to do that.
Okay. Showing you Exhibit 534. You see at the top, here it says the name Jodi Arias, right?
I do.
And then check marks, right?
Yes.
And then for question 13, you see it says item 12, right?
Yes.
And the writing is repeated emotional/psychological abuse, right?
Yes.
And if this information is taken and copied exactly onto the PDS booklet, that wouldn't be a problem then, right? As long as it's the same information that's copied.
If it was copied accurately.
Okay. And can you see the difference in handwriting between where we see repeated emotional and psychological abuse and, let's say, circle numbers that apply? Can you see the difference in handwriting there?
Yes, but I'm not a handwriting expert.
I know, just in your opinion.
Objection, overruled.
You said yes, but you're not an expert?
And the question is, do I see differences in
Yeah, do you see a
handwriting?
difference in handwriting where it says item 12, repeated emotional and psychological abuse, and then just a line down where it says circle numbers that apply?
I could say it looks a little different.
Just
Yes.
a little, okay. I have nothing further, thank you.
Any other questions from the jury? All right, ladies and gentlemen, have any of you seen anything about this case in the media? Have you read anything, heard anything? I see no hands. Has anyone attempted to talk with you about this case other than court staff and people associated with this trial? I see no hands. All right, no trial tomorrow, no trial on Monday. Tuesday, 9:30 a.m. Please remember the admonition. Are there any questions? Have a nice weekend. Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Dr. DeMarte, did you have a question?
I was just going to ask about my materials that were taken.
All right, we will resolve that issue here shortly. Counsel, anything else?
No, thank you.
All right, we're at recess. Please approach counsel before you leave.